Nestled in a gentle valley, shielded by rolling hills and thick forests, the village of Altenburg seemed untouched by the relentless turmoil of the wider world. Its narrow cobblestone streets wound between clusters of half-timbered houses, each with smoke curling lazily from its chimneys, carrying the scent of wood fires and fresh bread. In the early morning, sunlight would splash across the red-tiled roofs, igniting the dew that clung to the window-panes, creating a sparkling mosaic that felt like a secret only the villagers themselves knew. Life here followed a comforting rhythm. The baker arrived just before dawn, the blacksmith's hammer rang out at predictable intervals, and children scampered through alleys, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Conversations were simple, often revolving around trivial matters like whose cow had wandered into whose garden, or which family had prepared the best jam that week. The villagers, warm and talkative, lived as though time itself paused at Altenburg's borders, insulating them from the chaos of distant battlefields. Occasionally, whispers of the war would drift through the air, news from a traveling salesman or a letter brought by the postman, but such tidings felt more like rumors from a storybook than a real threat to their existence. For the residents, the war was abstract, muffled by hills and forests, and largely irrelevant to their daily routines of work, prayer, and celebration. Yet, beneath the surface of this placid life, subtle hints of the extraordinary began to stir, though no one would have recognized them as such. A strange pattern of lights in the forest at dusk, an unfamiliar voice carried on the wind, or the fleeting shadow of a figure moving too deliberately among the trees. These anomalies brushed against the edges of their awareness, dismissed as tricks of the eye or imagination. Altenburg had always seemed ordinary, almost mundane, yet the village itself was perched unknowingly atop a thread that would soon unravel a web far larger and far darker than anything the villagers could imagine. This ordinary facade, paired with the village's unremarkable rhythm, was precisely what made it the perfect cradle for secrets. Life in Altenburg was predictable, safe, and serene, but hidden beneath that serene surface, something both astonishing and perilous lay in wait. The quiet streets and familiar faces were a prelude, a deceptive calm before the storm that would sweep through their world and forever alter their perception of reality. Even as Altenburg clung to its comforting routines, the distant echoes of the war began to ripple through the valley, faint at first but growing steadily impossible to ignore. The news arrived sporadically, a letter from a distant cousin, worn and creased from travel, the fleeting glimpse of a soldier trudging down the main road, and the subtle hum of military vehicles passing along the outskirts. Villagers listened with polite interest but largely shrugged it off, convinced that their secluded hamlet, hemmed in by hills and thick woodland, remained insulated from the conflict raging beyond the horizon. Life, they reassured one another, would continue as it always had, untouched by the faraway chaos. Yet the war had a way of creeping into the edges of everyday life. Rationing began to gnaw at even the most careful households. Flour, sugar, and coffee arrived in ever-diminishing quantities, accompanied by long lines at the market. Housewives exchanged recipes that could stretch a meager portion into a full meal, while children whispered curiously about the strange labels on canned goods. The blacksmith noticed a shortage of iron, forcing him to improvise repairs for wagons and plows. Even the pastor, usually a pillar of calm, found his sermons edged with hints of uncertainty, urging his congregation to remain vigilant and resilient in the face of the unseen storm. The tension grew not only through scarcity, but also through the subtle anomalies that began to appear at the village's periphery. Travelers with unfamiliar accents and furtive eyes moved along the forest paths, seemingly more observers than visitors. Unmarked deliveries arrived at the town square, parcels wrapped in brown paper with no return address, left at the inn or abandoned along less-traveled roads. A pair of soldiers, unfamiliar in uniform and wary in demeanor, questioned the villagers briefly before disappearing as quietly as they had come, leaving behind only unease. Every glance from the edge of the woods seemed to carry a hidden meaning, every unaccounted noise a muted warning. Still, the villagers persisted in their routines, partly out of habit, partly out of denial. They mended fences, baked bread, tended gardens, and greeted one another warmly each morning, as if their daily rituals could shield them from the outside world's encroaching shadow. And yet, an unspoken awareness began to settle over Altenburg. Something was happening just beyond the veil of familiarity, something that didn't belong to the ordinary cadence of village life. While the fields and cobblestone streets remained unchanged, the tension at the edges, the strange visitors, the odd deliveries, the whispers of the war, hinted that the village's isolation was fragile, temporary, and about to be pierced by a reality far more dangerous and extraordinary than anyone could yet imagine. The subtle encroachment of war, almost imperceptible, marked the first fractures in Altenburg's placid facade. Life seemed normal, yet the edges were fraying, and beneath the surface, a sense of anticipation and unease began to thrum, a quiet drumbeat signaling that the village's tranquil days were numbered. The quiet tension that had begun to weave itself through Altenburg found its first tangible expression one crisp autumn morning, when an unusual delivery arrived at the edge of the village. A wagon, drawn by a pair of mules unfamiliar to the local stable hands, rumbled down the uneven path leading to an abandoned farmhouse that had stood empty for nearly a decade. Its wooden shutters, weathered and splintered, banged against the frame with each gust of wind, giving the impression that the building itself was protesting the intrusion. The villagers, curious but cautious, gathered at a respectful distance, whispering guesses about the wagon's contents and the identity of its driver. The crates themselves were peculiar, unmarked, sealed with iron clasps that gleamed unnaturally in the morning light, and oddly heavy for their size. No one in Altenburg had ever seen such packaging, and even the blacksmith, familiar with the various tools and goods that passed through the village, shrugged in confusion. The farmer who owned the surrounding fields approached first, offering polite inquiries that were met with evasive answers from the driver, a man whose accent hinted at origins far beyond the valley. He asked for directions to a nearby crossroad, where he claimed he would meet someone to take the crates further. There was something in his voice, clipped and careful, that set the villagers' nerves on edge, though none could have articulated why. Over the following days, other anomalies began to surface. Strange lights flickered in the farmhouse windows at odd hours, and a faint humming sound, mechanical in nature, seemed to emanate from within. Children, daring one another, peeked through cracks in the shutters, only to rush back in wide-eyed, claiming to have seen shadows moving in impossible ways. Occasionally, the radio, an object more common in neighboring towns than in Altenburg, emitted odd bursts of static and faint, indecipherable signals, as though someone or something was attempting to communicate through the air itself. The villagers, practical and grounded, dismissed these events as coincidences or tricks of the imagination, yet an undercurrent of unease began to settle over even the most skeptical. These small, seemingly insignificant anomalies, the odd delivery, the mysterious driver, the flickering lights and indecipherable signals, were the first threads of a much larger tapestry. Each detail, isolated on its own, might have been ignored, forgotten, or rationalized. But together, they formed a pattern, subtle and almost imperceptible, that hinted at forces moving in secret just beyond the village's awareness. Altenburg's placid existence was beginning to fracture, and though the villagers could not yet see it, the first clue had been delivered, a quiet, enigmatic herald of the extraordinary events soon to unfold. The odd delivery and the mysterious activity at the abandoned farmhouse stirred a quiet excitement among a small group of Altenburg's residents, who could not resist the pull of curiosity. Among them were Matthias, the young blacksmith with an insatiable appetite for puzzles, Greta, the innkeeper's daughter, whose sharp eyes missed little in the village, and Herr Klein, a retired postal worker who had grown accustomed to noticing irregularities in letters and parcels over decades. Their curiosity was as much a product of boredom as of concern. The daily rhythm of the village suddenly seemed too predictable, too confined, and the allure of a hidden mystery was impossible to resist. Their initial attempts were tentative, marked by the careful hesitation of ordinary people stepping into extraordinary circumstances. They began by observing the farmhouse from the tree-line, crouched behind hedges and low walls, noting the comings and goings of figures who seemed deliberately obscure, wearing dark coats and keeping their faces partially hidden. The villagers whispered in hushed tones, exchanging fragmented observations and piecing together patterns that seemed almost imperceptible to the casual eye. Each detail, how the crates were unloaded, the timing of the strange lights, the subtle signals in the radio static, became a thread to be tugged, a clue to unravel the mystery that had settled over Altenburg. Eventually, their curiosity drove them closer. One evening, Matthias and Greta dared to approach the crates themselves, noting their weight, the iron clasps, and the strange symbols etched faintly into the wood, almost invisible unless examined carefully. The crates emitted a faint metallic hum, a subtle vibration that sent shivers through their arms, but neither dared to open them. Herr Klein, from a safe distance, attempted to record observations in his notebook, detailing every nuance, the angles at which the crates were stacked, the patterns of footprints in the soft earth, and the fleeting glimpses of figures moving behind the windows. Their efforts were clumsy but earnest, ordinary villagers armed with nothing but intuition, courage, and a deep-seated sense of curiosity that drove them into territory far beyond their experience. On another occasion, they followed a stranger who had lingered near the farmhouse longer than usual. The figure moved quickly, with a precision and purpose that unnerved the group, disappearing into the forest before they could confront him. The villagers' hearts raced, a mix of exhilaration and fear propelling them onward, highlighting both their bravery and their naivety. Each step, each decision, carried a risk they did not fully comprehend. They were not trained spies or investigators. They were ordinary people, guided solely by instinct and the tantalizing possibility that the ordinary world they knew had been quietly invaded by something extraordinary. As the nights grew longer and the shadows deeper, their investigations continued, a careful dance of observation and stealth. The tension in Altenburg thickened. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the village held its breath alongside the three observers. Every movement, every unexplained sound or light, now held double meaning, teasing them toward discoveries that might change their understanding of the world. In their naive courage and restless curiosity, they became the first sentinels of a secret far larger than the village itself, a secret that had been patiently waiting for eyes sharp enough and daring enough to notice its presence. The culmination of the villagers' cautious investigations came on a moonless night when curiosity and bravery converged with chance. Matthias, Greta, and Herr Klein had decided to return to the abandoned farmhouse after dark, guided by a series of subtle observations and the increasingly impossible anomalies surrounding the crates. The air was crisp, and the faint smell of burning leaves from distant fields hung over the village, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, and the occasional drip of water from the farmhouse roof, turning the familiar surroundings into a stage set for the extraordinary. The initial discovery was almost accidental. Greta, crouched near the side of the house, noticed that one of the floorboards in the ground level shifted slightly when pressed. It was subtle, nearly invisible, as though the house itself had conspired to hide it from the casual eye. Matthias knelt beside her, hands trembling as he pried the board loose, revealing a narrow hatch. A faint draught escaped from the opening, carrying with it a metallic tang and the unmistakable hint of machinery. Herr Klein peered over their shoulders, eyes wide, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Together they descended into a confined space, the ladder creaking beneath their weight, and were met with a scene that defied belief. Beneath the farmhouse lay a labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers, carefully concealed beneath decades of neglect and earth. Along the walls, crates similar to the ones that had first drawn attention were stacked meticulously, each marked with cryptic symbols and numbers that seemed to pulse with hidden significance. In one corner, a complex array of radio equipment hummed quietly, wires snaking along the floor, connecting to a set of dials and antennas designed for long-range communication. Greta reached out, nearly touching a spinning wheel of coded messages, realizing in that moment the tools they were witnessing were far beyond anything a normal villager, or even local authorities, would expect to find in such a remote location. The group's astonishment was compounded by the realization of the scale and sophistication of the operation. Secret compartments in the walls held more cryptic documents, some written in languages only partially familiar to Herr Klein, others in codes that danced across the page like mathematical riddles. Small, intricate maps detailed regions far beyond Altenburg, with routes marked in careful, deliberate patterns. The villagers could not fully grasp the purpose of each item, yet instinctively understood that this was no ordinary storage, no mundane collection of supplies. It was a fully operational spy network, a hidden machine of espionage carefully concealed beneath their very feet. Fear mingled with wonder. Matthias whispered, almost to himself, that they were not merely trespassing on private property. They had stumbled into a mechanism that could change lives, topple plans, or even dictate the fates of nations. Greta's hands shook as she traced the dials of the radio equipment, imagining messages being sent across borders, intercepted lives dangling at the whim of unseen operators. Herr Klein, usually composed, muttered under his breath about the danger of discovery, realizing that if the people controlling this network knew anyone had stumbled upon their secrets, the consequences would be immediate and severe. As they explored further, the scope of the network became chillingly clear. Tiny tunnels led to ventilation shafts, perhaps designed for quick exits or secret movements. Crates contained delicate instruments, scales of measurement, and bundles of paper that hinted at intelligence far beyond Altenburg's comprehension. Each corner of the underground chambers seemed designed with purpose and precision, as though every stone, wire, and board had been placed to evade detection. In that moment, the villagers felt the full weight of what they had uncovered, a hidden web of spies, operating silently and methodically, threading through the very veins of their quiet village. The realization settled over them like a cold shadow. Altenburg, with its cobblestone streets, familiar faces, and placid rhythm, was now a stage for forces far greater and far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. The ordinary curiosity that had driven them into the farmhouse had inadvertently placed them at the center of a clandestine world, one where discovery could mean peril, and where each step forward would demand caution, courage, and cunning beyond anything they had ever known. In the hush of the underground, the villagers understood something undeniable. Their lives, and the life of the village itself, had been irrevocably changed. The night of the discovery left Matthias, Greta, and Herr Klein restless, haunted not only by what they had seen but by what they now knew they could not ignore. They returned to their homes in silence, the usual comfort of familiar walls offering little solace. Each step along the cobblestone streets seemed heavier, burdened with the weight of secrets too large for any ordinary village to bear. In the days that followed, the trio wrestled with a gnawing question. What should they do with this knowledge? Debates erupted quietly, initially in whispered conversations behind closed doors. Matthias argued for immediate disclosure, insisting that such a network could not be allowed to operate unchecked. If we alert the authorities, he said, even a distant police or military force, maybe lives can be saved, wars shortened, people protected. Greta, however, feared the consequences of exposure, the wrath of the unknown operators, and the possible danger to the villagers themselves. "We cannot simply hand this over," she countered. "If they suspect us, if anyone here is compromised, the village could be destroyed. Even our families could be at risk." Herr Klein, more measured but no less tense, reminded them that morality was rarely straightforward in situations such as this. "We are no longer just villagers," he said, "and with knowledge comes responsibility. But every choice carries risk. Sometimes silence is protection, and sometimes it is complicity." Their deliberations were punctuated by paranoia, a creeping awareness that the spy network could have eyes and ears everywhere. The normally friendly faces of neighbors became subjects of scrutiny, and casual conversations were dissected for hidden meanings. Strange occurrences, a visitor at the inn who asked too many questions, a merchant delivering goods with an unusual care, or even an unfamiliar traveler pausing too long in the square, were interpreted through the lens of fear. Each sound in the night, each shadow on the walls, became a potential signal, and the trio found themselves questioning not only outsiders but familiar friends and acquaintances. Secret meetings became a ritual, held in barns, empty rooms, and behind hedgerows, always in whispered tones and with careful vigilance. They discussed the pros and cons of reporting the spy network, the potential consequences of acting on their own, and the slim possibility of leveraging their knowledge to protect the village without attracting attention. They drafted tentative plans, mapping routes for information delivery, imagining coded messages, and speculating on whether there could be allies in distant towns or cities who might intervene. The tension in these meetings was palpable, a mixture of fear, excitement, and ethical confusion that made even mundane decisions, such as who would fetch bread or fetch water, feel heavy with consequence. The moral complexity of their position weighed on them most heavily at night, when the village slept unaware of the storm gathering beneath their feet. Should they prioritize safety or justice, action or inaction? They were neither soldiers nor spies, yet they had been thrust into a shadowed world where every choice carried potential for harm or salvation. In hushed tones, Greta would remark on the human cost. Lives are in those tunnels, and yet, if we intervene, lives here could be lost too. Matthias would reply, equally torn, but doing nothing is a choice too. Are we willing to carry that? Even Herr Klein, experienced in the small intrigues of letters and parcels, found himself shaken, realizing that no procedural wisdom could offer a clear answer. In this crucible of fear and moral ambiguity, the villagers' ordinary lives were irrevocably transformed. The quiet rhythm of Altenburg, its routines, its gossip, its gentle certainties, was replaced by vigilance, debate, and dread. Each day demanded choices, each glance carried suspicion, and each silence was laden with meaning. For the first time, the village, once blissfully unaware, understood the fragile boundary between peace and peril, between innocence and complicity. In grappling with these decisions, Matthias, Greta, and Herr Klein became not only witnesses to extraordinary events, but moral agents navigating a landscape where right and wrong were obscured by danger, secrecy, and the weight of knowledge far larger than themselves. The unease that had taken root in Altenburg began to deepen as subtle changes in the village signaled that the hidden network's operators were aware of unusual activity. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A delivery wagon arrived slightly off schedule, an unfamiliar figure lingered too long near the outskirts, and the innkeeper noted a visitor who seemed to watch the townsfolk more than the town itself. Matthias, Greta, and Herr Klein recognized the signs immediately, their prior investigations lending them a sensitivity to anomalies that others could not perceive. Yet even with this awareness, the village's serene exterior made the danger almost maddeningly invisible, every ordinary street and friendly face now a potential threat. The first close call came unexpectedly one evening. Greta had ventured near the farmhouse to collect information she believed might clarify the scope of the spy network. A sudden beam of light swept across the yard, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Heart hammering, she pressed herself against a hedge, the leaves scratching her arms as if reminding her of the stakes. She held her breath as a shadow moved toward the crates, inspecting them with deliberate care. Not daring to move, she watched until the figure disappeared, silently praying that her presence had gone unnoticed. The incident left her shaken, but it also sharpened her instincts. The game had shifted. Altenburg was no longer merely a backdrop for curiosity. It had become a stage for a deadly dance, where a single misstep could draw the attention of highly trained operators. The villagers quickly adapted, transforming their homes, barns, and everyday haunts into temporary fortresses of secrecy. Crates were observed only from a distance. Notes were exchanged in code, scribbled on scraps of paper, and passed under doors or tucked inside the folds of laundry. Matthias discovered a concealed alcove behind the blacksmith's forge, a shadowed space where the trio could hide and observe the farmhouse unseen. Greta memorized every path through the narrow lanes, every blind corner, imagining escape routes in case discovery became imminent. Herr Klein, ever methodical, devised signals to alert one another to approaching strangers, an arrangement as precarious as it was vital, relying on timing, memory, and a blend of intuition and luck. Each day brought new tests of nerve. An unfamiliar truck rumbled along the main road, its cargo unknown and its driver inscrutable. Villagers who had once greeted each other casually now exchanged wary glances, silently questioning who might be aligned with the hidden operators. Even the children's innocent games became a source of anxiety, as stray footsteps or laughter could betray their presence. The tension pressed upon every action, turning mundane chores into exercises in calculated risk. Fetching water, repairing a fence, or lighting a fire at the forge became acts laden with danger, forcing ordinary people to operate under the heightened scrutiny of an invisible audience. The suspense reached a crescendo during one night when the farmhouse's interior was suddenly illuminated by a series of harsh, swinging lights. The villagers froze in their hiding spots, the faint hum of the radio equipment faintly audible beneath the wind's whistling. Each shadow seemed exaggerated, each sound magnified. Matthias's heart pounded, Greta's fingers trembled, and her Klein felt the weight of decades pressing down with a clarity that was almost unbearable. Yet in this heightened state of awareness, they also discovered their ingenuity. Paths were memorized, lookout points carefully selected, and each movement orchestrated with precision born from necessity. Through these trials, the village learned to move like ghosts, blending routine with vigilance, curiosity with discretion. Altenburg remained outwardly unchanged, its cobblestone streets and chimneys appearing as innocent as ever, while beneath the surface a tense, dangerous rhythm governed every step, glance, and breath. The villagers' ordinary lives had become a balancing act on the knife's edge, a test of courage and cunning against an unseen, omnipresent adversary. In this shadowed world, they were no longer mere observers. They had become players in a deadly game of cat and mouse, acutely aware that the smallest miscalculation could have devastating consequences. The villagers' careful vigilance, though effective, could only carry them so far. Rumors and fear had begun to suffocate the sense of normalcy in Altenburg, and it became increasingly clear that their limited knowledge and experience were insufficient against an organized and dangerous spy network. It was during one of their clandestine observation sessions that they first encountered the outsider, a man whose appearance was as unremarkable as it was deceptive. He emerged from the forest's edge one dusk, his coat dusted with dirt, boots caked in mud, and eyes scanning with a precision that immediately set the villagers on alert. Matthias, Greta, and her Klein instinctively retreated to their concealment, hearts racing, yet the man's movements suggested he was no threat. After several tense days, he introduced himself as Emil, a former intelligence operative now embedded in the local resistance. He spoke in quiet, deliberate tones, revealing that he had been tracking movements in the region for weeks, monitoring unusual activity consistent with covert operations. Emil's knowledge of coded messages, clandestine communications, and counter-surveillance immediately transformed the villagers' understanding of their discovery. What had seemed like an isolated, mysterious phenomenon was suddenly placed within the broader context of the war, a carefully orchestrated network feeding intelligence to forces far beyond Altenburg. Under Emil's guidance, the villagers began to see their role not merely as accidental observers, but as potential participants in a larger effort to counteract the network. He taught them how to record patterns of activity without leaving traces, how to create safe signals for communication, and how to anticipate the movements of the spies without putting themselves directly in harm's way. Each lesson was rooted in practicality, the positioning of shadows, the timing of footsteps, and the careful observation of human behavior. Matthias absorbed these instructions eagerly, seeing his own curiosity and resourcefulness sharpened into disciplined vigilance. Greta, naturally perceptive, quickly internalized Emil's methods, learning to blend observation with intuition, while her Klein's methodical nature allowed him to catalogue findings, creating a record that could be used strategically. Perhaps most crucially, Emil provided context for the villagers' discovery. He explained that the network they had uncovered was part of a far-reaching espionage system, one that had infiltrated multiple towns and villages, using unsuspecting rural communities as conduits for intelligence. The villagers, through their accidental discovery, now held knowledge that could have strategic significance, and Emil stressed the importance of discretion, patience, and coordination. In his presence, fear was still present, but it was tempered by strategy and a newfound sense of purpose. The introduction of Emil into Altenburg's secret world marked a turning point. The villagers were no longer isolated actors navigating danger by instinct alone. They had a guide, a mentor, and a bridge to the broader currents of the war. With his assistance, the farmhouse and its hidden tunnels were no longer merely a site of fear and curiosity. They became a strategic observation point, a location where ordinary villagers could contribute meaningfully to the resistance while remaining cautious, anonymous, and alive. Emil's presence, calm yet commanding, imbued them with a sense of agency, framing their discovery not as an accident but as a responsibility intertwined with a greater, perilous struggle unfolding across the continent. The presence of Emil infused the villagers with a sense of purpose, yet it also brought the stark realization that action carried immense risk. What had begun as cautious observation and private deliberation now demanded decisive steps. Altenburg's peaceful streets and familiar faces were no longer safe shields. The spy network had been operating in plain sight for months, perhaps years, and any delay could allow crucial intelligence to slip beyond reach. After several nights of hushed discussion in the blacksmith's hidden alcove, Matthias, Greta, Herr Klein, and Emil devised a plan that balanced audacity with caution, a strategy that could either dismantle the network or endanger them all. The first phase involved gathering irrefutable evidence while minimizing exposure. Under Emil's guidance, the villagers catalogued the movement of crates, the timing of signals, and the layout of the underground tunnels. Greta, nimble and observant, crept into the farmhouse during periods of low activity, photographing equipment, noting codes, and memorizing the placement of concealed compartments. Matthias, leveraging his familiarity with tools, managed minor disruptions, loosening screws on mechanical devices just enough to delay operations without drawing immediate suspicion. Herr Klein meticulously recorded these observations, developing a ledger of anomalies that could later serve as proof to authorities. Every movement was orchestrated to avoid detection, every step calculated with precision born from necessity. The second phase required the creation of secure communication with external authorities. Emil instructed the villagers in encoding messages that could be transmitted via ordinary channels without arousing suspicion. Letters disguised as routine correspondences, shipments marked with innocent trade labels, and subtle signals through common radio frequencies were employed to relay information. Greta's keen mind excelled at weaving subtle indicators into daily patterns, a particular arrangement of laundry, the placement of a pot on the windowsill, that served as coded confirmation when messages were successfully transmitted. The process was painstaking, requiring constant vigilance and repeated verification, as a single error could compromise the entire operation. Simultaneously, the villagers orchestrated small acts of sabotage to hinder the network without drawing immediate attention. Crates were subtly shifted, wires temporarily disconnected, and signal strength subtly disrupted. Each act was deliberate, calculated to slow operations while leaving no overt trace of interference. Matthias, working late into the night, became adept at manipulating mechanisms in ways that delayed communications just long enough for authorities to receive advance warning. Every disruption carried the gnawing fear that discovery would bring swift and violent retaliation. The final phase demanded courage and coordination. The villagers set traps designed to alert them if the network's operators attempted to investigate the farmhouse. A system of quietly arranged obstacles, subtle noise triggers, and improvised alarms ensured that any intrusion would be detected before it could reach critical areas. Even as these precautions were implemented, tension remained constant. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, and every distant vehicle rattling along the village road heightened their sense of peril. Altenburg, outwardly tranquil, had become a theatre of suspense, each resident a participant in a dangerous gamble where timing, stealth, and intuition were the only shields between success and disaster. As the plan unfolded, a palpable sense of unity and purpose emerged. Fear remained ever present, but it was tempered by a shared understanding that their ordinary lives had intersected with extraordinary events. Each member of the group became acutely aware that the margin for error was razor-thin. One misstep could expose the network's operators, triggering retaliation not only against them but potentially against the entire village. Yet in this crucible of danger, the villagers discovered a resourcefulness and resilience they had never imagined, embracing the precarious dance between strategy and courage with a clarity born of necessity. The night of the first coordinated action arrived, shrouded in darkness and anticipation. As they executed their plan, sending coded messages, subtly sabotaging equipment, and monitoring traps, the tension was suffocating. Every shadow could conceal discovery, every sound could herald danger, and yet the villagers moved with a careful, deliberate rhythm, each aware that success could strike a blow against the hidden forces that had threatened their world. In that moment, Altenburg, once blissfully unaware of the war beyond its borders, became a focal point of quiet heroism, the ordinary transformed into extraordinary, and the stakes as high as any battlefield. The morning after their calculated actions unfolded, Altenburg awoke to a world subtly transformed. The once placid village now bore the weight of its brush with danger, each street and household marked, if only in memory, by the extraordinary events that had quietly played out beneath its feet. Word spread that authorities, acting on the carefully transmitted intelligence, had conducted a series of arrests in nearby towns, capturing several key operatives connected to the spy network. The network, intricate and dangerous, began to unravel, its operations hampered, its reach curtailed, all because of the courage and ingenuity of a few ordinary villagers. For Matthias, Greta, and Herr Klein, the victory was tempered by a profound sense of loss. Even as the network's dismantling brought relief, it left behind an invisible trail of consequences. Some villagers experienced the stark realization that their once safe routines could no longer be taken for granted. A few families faced scrutiny from authorities eager to confirm allegiances, and whispers of suspicion lingered, fueled by fear and misunderstanding. The village's reputation, once defined by quaint charm and serene isolation, was forever altered. Altenburg was now known beyond its hills, a place where ordinary people had intersected directly with the hidden machinery of war. Personal sacrifices weighed heavily on those who had acted. Matthias often found his hands trembling when working at the forge, the adrenaline of that night still coursing through his veins. Greta sometimes awoke from dreams where shadows moved like the spies' figures, a persistent reminder of the danger they had faced. Herr Klein, though proud of the meticulous record he had kept, carried the burden of knowing that their actions had placed them all in peril, a responsibility that would not easily fade. Each sleepless night and each lingering fear was a testament to the cost of courage, a reminder that heroism was rarely without personal price. Yet alongside the fear and trauma was recognition, quiet but meaningful. Emil, the guide who had framed their discovery within the broader struggle of the war, commended their vigilance, strategy, and resolve, emphasizing that their ordinary lives had intersected with extraordinary events in a way few could ever imagine. Authorities, in reports and private acknowledgments, noted the critical role Altenburg had played in destabilizing a far-reaching espionage network, a contribution that rippled outward to influence military strategy and intelligence operations. The villagers' bravery had tangible consequences: the disruption of enemy operations, the protection of countless lives, and the reinforcement of the principle that courage, even in the smallest communities, could shape the course of events far beyond its borders. In the weeks that followed, life in Altenburg slowly settled into a new rhythm. The cobblestone streets, the smoke rising from chimneys, and the daily chatter in the square returned, yet nothing felt quite the same. Ordinary routines were tinged with the knowledge of what had transpired. The villagers carried in their hearts a mixture of pride, vigilance, and the lingering shadow of fear. They had discovered something hidden, acted decisively despite danger, and lived to see the results. Their story became a quiet legend, a testament to human courage, the unpredictable consequences of curiosity, and the extraordinary impact ordinary people could have when faced with the machinery of a world at war. In the end, Altenburg's heroism was measured not only in strategic outcomes, but in the personal courage of its inhabitants. The village had been changed forever, scarred by fear, yet elevated by bravery, proving that even the smallest, quietest communities could stand against forces far larger than themselves, shaping history one courageous choice at a time. In the quiet aftermath of the war, Altenburg slowly reclaimed its outward serenity, yet beneath the surface, the village had been irrevocably transformed. Cobblestone streets, once echoing with casual chatter, now carried the weight of memory, each step a reminder of the extraordinary events that had unfolded in the shadows. Ordinary villagers, who had once lived lives governed by routine and simplicity, had become unwitting actors in a drama far beyond their imagination, their courage quietly reshaping the course of events. Matthias, Greta, and Herr Klein, along with others who had played smaller but no less significant roles, understood that their lives would never again be untouched by the knowledge of what lay beneath the farmhouse floorboards or the hum of hidden radio equipment. The transformation was not only practical but deeply personal. The villagers had discovered reserves of bravery, ingenuity, and resilience they had not known they possessed. Simple gestures, preparing a meal, repairing a roof, walking through the forest, were forever tinged with awareness of the fragility of peace, the thin line between safety and danger. Conversations, once centered on trivial matters, now carried an undercurrent of experience, of understanding that ordinary life was interwoven with extraordinary potential. Altenburg had grown up, in a sense, forced into a maturity dictated by circumstance rather than choice. Yet the transformation was bittersweet. The fear, tension, and uncertainty of those months lingered, shadowing even the most mundane days. The villagers carried scars invisible to the eye, restless nights, memories of close calls, and the haunting knowledge of what might have occurred had their efforts failed. There was pride, certainly, in the lives saved and the network disrupted, but it existed alongside a quiet sorrow, an acknowledgment of the price paid for heroism and the fragility of human security. Altenburg's heroism had not been celebrated with fanfare. It had been a silent, steadfast endurance, shaping the war in ways the wider world would never fully see. Looking back, the village itself seemed altered, as if the very air remembered the events that had passed through it. Altenburg remained quaint and familiar, yet beneath its surface lay hidden layers of history, bravery, and resilience that could never be erased. The villagers, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in action, had glimpsed the wider currents of the world and proven that courage often emerges in the quietest of places. Peace had returned, fragile but tangible, yet the memories lingered, proof that even in the smallest communities, history leaves enduring traces, shaping both the land and the people who inhabit it.